You can't choose your neighbors. If you're moving to a new home, you can to a degree. While shopping for a new place, if you will pay attention to the area around the neighboring homes, you might know what sort of neighbors you'll have for the foreseeable future. Unkept property along with various other signs will clue you in to what life will be like in the neighborhood. However, after you buy the place and move in, you never know who's going to move in next door a year later. This is what happened to us after buying a home in a rural area with a few acres in Mississippi. In 2008, my wife and I wanted to get away from the city. The city we loved all our lives had turned violent. The politics, the violent crime, the traffic, and the devaluing of homes all over the county left us with no choice. So we began to look for a quiet place to live out our middle-aged years in peace. My wife was a bit apprehensive about moving away from good health care and family, but the desire to get to a peaceful place overrode all those concerns. We were in our early 50s. I was not retired, and my job allowed me to work from anywhere as long as the internet was available. We settled on an existing home on 5 acres of land. Our nearest neighbor was within eyesight, but the distance was such that we didn't feel like that they were close. The place next to us was well taken care of, and after meeting our neighbors, we knew we had chosen a good place to live. Within 6 months, however, that property went up for sale and it sold quickly. Within a month of the for sale sign coming down, our new neighbors moved in. That weekend gave us a good idea of how life would be for us for the next 3 years. They threw a party in the backyard. Rap music blared all night. Cars were in and out until the early morning, and we didn't get much sleep, and our 2 dogs barked at the noise all night. The next day I rode my ATV over to meet these people and to let them know that my hope was that these parties would be few. My first trip over produced no interactions. I knew the hangovers would be bad for these people, and I gave them some time. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, there was life stirring around the house, so I went back over. And there's no need to describe the conversation that followed, but it was not pleasant. I was told that this was their property, and they would do whatever they wanted whenever they wanted, and that I needed to F off. I didn't need a confrontation, so I left, but it would have been my great pleasure to put this punk in the hospital for a few days. But I'm a grown man now, and I learned a while back to avoid these conflicts unless I have no choice. The new homeowner, or tenant, I would later discover, was a 20-something white male who had an affection for the urban gangland lifestyle, music, and wardrobe. It has amazed me that some of the younger generation want to appear as stupid-looking as possible. The fact that this kid was a redneck from a small town in Mississippi made him look even more ignorant. My guess is that if he had been transplanted immediately to an actual urban gangland environment, he would have folded in a second. I figured that he would soon find out that he was not as bad as he thought he was, because there was no doubt that he would soon be a convict at Parchman before he was 30. Inmates there have a way of sorting out the misfits. But that was none of my business. I just hoped that we would have no more trouble for them, and I will say now that we personally didn't. There were a few times over the following months when they deprived us of sleep, but it was not often, and the situation was bearable. Later, checking the records in the courthouse, it appeared the property was owned by his father, a wealthy North Mississippi businessman. I didn't know, and I didn't care who the actual property owner was. The records for the property was down the hall from the tax collector's office, so while buying tags for my car one day, I walked down and I looked them up. This has no relevance to this story other than to give you a feel for the kind of person that we were dealing with at the time. The new neighbors moved in during December, and by May, a new chain-link fence had been installed behind their house. 4 large pit bull dogs were now being kept inside the fence. The fence was tall, 6 feet tall, and we never worried that the dogs would escape. That was not the problem. By July, there were 15 or 20 pit bulls inside this fence. They were all staked to a short, heavy chain with no shelter. The dogs appeared healthy. I saw the tenant feeding and watering the dogs each morning, but it was hot that summer and those dogs roasted in the sun during the hot months. My wife and I love dogs. We have two. One is actually a pit bull rescue. He's a big teddy bear and we take great care of our dogs. But my neighbor, on the other hand, looked to be training these dogs for something else. On the other side of their place, a privacy fence went up. It was not a large area, and at first I thought they built it to conceal the trash cans. I noticed my neighbor and two other men taking two dogs into that fenced area, and soon I could hear dogs fighting. The men would be screaming at the dogs, provoking them to attack each other. I never saw it happen, but it was obvious what they were doing. And then during the fall, I would see the tenant was out among the 15 or 20 chained dogs. He would pick a few of them out and beat them with a limber stick until they became aggressive with him. Some would cower in fear, and those were taken to his car and removed. I suppose they were given away or just dropped out somewhere. I thought he just got a kick out of being cruel to animals, but a friend visiting me one day told me that the guy was raising fighting dogs and he was probably selling them. Allow me to stop here and qualify that at that time there were no laws in this county that made anything he was doing illegal. I once saw the sheriff at a local restaurant and I asked him about it. He straight up said there was nothing he could do and suggested that I contact one of the national groups that handle these things. I did that and I never heard from the organization again. In addition, those were his dogs. They weren't mine. It was not my place to tell him what to do with his property. If there was something I could have done, I would have done it. There were 2 instances where dogs escaped and they found their way to the back of my house. I armed myself and approached them slowly, only to find that these dogs were just happy to have some gentle human reaction. They were not well-mannered, meaning that they jumped all over my wife and I, and one got pretty rough with me, but at no time did they seem aggressive. Both of those dogs were taken to a shelter many miles away in another state. I never returned them to the owner. Maybe that is the best I could do, and I hoped more would escape and make their way to my house, but none ever did. And since that time frame, the city and county have passed animal cruelty ordinances, and officials strictly enforce them. Dogs on chains are forbidden inside the city limits, and in the county, the dogs must be well cared for with shelter, water, and food. The owners get one warning. After that, the dogs are removed and taken to an adoption service. And I'm pleased that my county now sees that these animals need protection. Now to the topic of Bigfoot. I have known that Bigfoot exists since I was a child. My grandfather showed them to me in Arkansas on his land years ago. But that is an entirely different story. As a child and a teenager, my grandfather showed me how to draw the creatures near to me. It takes a lot of time. So when we moved to the country, my first thought was to see how many, if any, Bigfoot inhabited the forests around us. With the steps I took, gifting and leaving subtle signs behind our home, finally I confirmed that a clan did indeed live in our woods. We never saw them, but we knew they were there. They let us know they were there in no uncertain terms. I know your stories are about Bigfoot, and in the stories you share, we get to hear about all the typical behaviors that Bigfoot exhibits. But I will leave that out of the story. My goal here is to tell you how Bigfoot handles cruel animal owners. However, I will mention that it is my experience that the big alpha males, or the fathers of the clans, usually stay in the background. They do not reveal themselves unless they need to as a show of dominance to other animals. We never saw signs of a huge alpha, but we knew he was there lurking in the shadows watching everything his clan did. The stories you hear over and over regarding children and animals being saved from critical situations, that is typically the result of a female Bigfoot intervening in the natural course of things. Males generally never do this, and it is my opinion that the patriarchal males probably disapprove of the female's intervention into human activities. But it happens anyway. I believe that a female, seeing a dire situation, will pull on the britches in the family and take matters into her own hands no matter what the male thinks. Back on the farm, the dog training and whipping seemed to get more serious as the fall months set in. The temperatures were cooling down, and by Thanksgiving it was chilly. My neighbor had begun doing his beating and training at night. They had installed 2 lights on each side of their fighting pen. I suppose this was to conceal what they were doing from neighbors like me. Maybe they just enjoyed the cooler nights. I don't know. Whatever the reason, the training intensified. On moonlit nights, I would go to the edge of my property after hearing noises from the creatures in the woods. It was a regular thing I did. When I knew the Bigfoot were close, I would sit in the yard close to the trees and just talk to them. Even though my wife believed in these creatures, she still thought that I was nuts for doing this, but I knew they were there. On some nights, there would be 3, maybe 4 creatures just beyond the light of my house. I could see movement and trees moving, and I could hear them breathing, especially when I would pitch a half a pone of cornbread into the woods or other table scraps that we didn't eat that night. I just knew they were there, and I felt like the last year had been productive in developing a relationship with our clan. In addition, I always knew when the creatures were behind my neighbor's house. The distance from my back porch was a long way, but I could clearly see the dogs in the moonlight. Every dog chained to the ground would get up and stretch that chain to the limit looking into those woods. Every tail would be wagging and all barking would instantly stop. By this time, there were between 20 and 30 dogs inside that fence. I wish you could have seen it because it would have given you great joy seeing those happy tails wagging. Now, I think I know what they were looking at. The creatures knew what was going on at that house, and it is my feeling that even though they did not like it, that Big Alpha forbid his clan from intervening. This went on for several weeks, and the tenants' training method grew more violent. The beatings became even more frequent. On a chilly night in March, I was awakened by a gunshot. It was not unusual for neighbors all around the area to shoot guns on their property, but I had never heard a gunshot at 2 in the morning. I got out of bed and I dressed quickly and was soon out on our back porch under the canopy. Rain fell in a steady shower. I tightened up the collar around my neck and I walked towards my neighbor's house. The whole backyard was lit up by lights attached to the house. He had a dog by the chain and was beating it unmercifully. I could hear the yelps and the squeals from the poor animal. The closer I got, the more clear the scene became visible in the misty conditions. He had a pistol in his hand, and he would shoot it in the air on occasion. It didn't make sense to me. I think he wanted to shoot those dogs, but he thought better, and he would shoot a round off in the air. Then he would go to another dog and start the process all over again. I had had it with this guy, and against my best judgment, I yelled to him to knock this crap off and leave the dogs alone. It was not the smartest move that I ever made. He did have a firearm and was probably under the influence of who knows what. He heard me, but he kept beating the dog he had in his hand until it began to fight back, at which point he released the dog and he moved to another. I yelled at him again, and this time he heard me and came to the fence, and he yelled something back that I did not understand. And then he went back inside. I returned home, I dried off, and I discussed the event with my wife. She wanted to do something, but still there was nothing we could do. If we stole the dogs or released them while he was away, we would be the criminals. That's what we wanted to do. It was frustrating for both of us. The nightly beatings continued. On a comfortable night in May, I sat on my back porch and I watched him head out to the large pen with his stick and open the gate. It was a few minutes past 11 p.m. I knew his pattern. He always started with the dogs closest to the gate, but for some reason we will never know, he went to the back of the enclosure and I suppose he was planning to work his way forward. Every dog cowered and laid flat to the ground as he walked through the area. There was no barking and no excitement. There was not a sound. They knew he was coming. He made it to the back of the enclosure, and instead of starting on the dogs, he leaned his back against the chain-link fence and lit a cigarette. I remember seeing the orange glow on his face when he would take a long draw. I just watched him. He was bouncing against the fence, leaning back into the give of the chain link and letting it push him forward. Over and over, he used the fence as a lateral trampoline, bouncing a bit harder each time until I could hear the fence creaking. He was letting the dogs feel his anger and getting them afraid of him even more. He thumped the cigarette butt at the closest dog, and I saw sparks settle on the animal, burning its hide while it moved to relieve the pain. There was a short yelp. He bounced himself off the fence one last time and leaned forward to commence this night's beating. But before he could take the first step, a massive black arm reached over the fence, and the last thing I saw was his legs being dragged over the top of the 6-foot-high top rail. No scream, no noise at all. He just vanished into the woods. I stood there for a minute in shock. What should I do? Should I call the police? Should I go knock on their door to see if anyone was home? I had never seen anyone living there, even though he did have visitors all the time. I reached for my cell phone and was about to dial 911, and I stopped. When the officers showed up, what was I going to tell them? A family of Bigfoot took him? Hell, they would put me in jail and probably consider me a suspect. I put the phone in my pocket and I walked inside. My wife was already in bed. I undressed and crawled in beside her, kissed her neck, and I went to sleep. It was a good night's sleep at that. The next day, I saw that nothing had changed at his house. The dogs were still there, the overgrown grass still annoyed me, and I wondered if I had dreamed all of this. I decided that I had been fully awake when it all happened, so I relaxed, I ate breakfast, and I started on a project that I had been planning to do for months. I was going to plant fast-growing trees at the edge of my property adjacent to his house so that I wouldn't have to look at the meanness after the trees grew large enough, however long that took. I finished late in the day, and soon it was dark. No one had showed up at that house. No one knew he was gone. I did see one car pull in the drive that night, but they turned around and left after seeing the tenant was not home. It was the fourth day after the incident that things began to happen. That morning, sometime before lunch, I saw 2 sheriff's cars in the driveway from my office window. I saved my work and I leaned out and watched. 2 deputies walked around the house several times and then stood by their cars. Soon, a civilian drove up. I assumed it was the father, and the deputies talked to him for a while and they all went inside the house. Not long after, there was a knock on my front door, and when I answered, one of the officers stood there with a pad and a pen. He asked me the usual questions, and I told them the last time I saw the tenant, he was in the backyard 3 nights ago beating his dogs, and that I paid no attention and that I went to bed. I had not seen him since. The officer seemed perplexed about the dog beating statement and asked about that further. I explained what I had seen the man do for the last few months and that I had told the sheriff about it. It seemed to ring a bell with the deputy, and he mumbled something about wishing they had the authority to stop the animal abuse in our area. I actually believed him. He asked if I had seen any activity at the house since, to which I replied no, but that I had not really been paying attention, and that was the truth. I then asked the deputy if I could go over and feed the dogs. If this guy had been missing for 3 days, I was sure the dogs were starving. He agreed that that was a good idea, and I headed over. I made my way into the garage to find the dog feed, and I saw several large bags in a utility room. Rats had chewed holes in all the bags, and I didn't know how old the dog food was, but it would be something for the animals until something got figured out. I found a 2.5-gallon bucket, I filled it with feed, and I walked into the fence. None of the dogs were aggressive with me. Some cowered away, but that was to be expected. Most were happy to see me. A few trips later, and I had all 24 dogs fed and watered. As I walked through the garage to leave, I heard the father saying something about drug deals and gangs, etc. I didn't catch enough to know what they were talking about, but I thought to myself, if they get on that trail, they wouldn't even investigate around the house. Maybe that would keep them out of the woods and away from the Bigfoot clan. That is exactly what happened. In the news, I read that the man had been tied to a local drug distribution ring and had been under surveillance by local authorities. I didn't have any idea he was under surveillance while I lived there, and of course that he was missing, and if anyone had any information to please call the number below. To my knowledge, no one ever called that number with anything of value to the investigation. Almost a year later, I was walking through the woods behind our house. I was looking for signs of the Bigfoot clan. I had not seen or heard from them since the night Tupac disappeared. I walked through the thick patch of briars, a place I had never explored, and I saw something that didn't belong. I approached the object and I saw a white Nike running shoe. It was dirty now, and it looked as if it had not been moved since it fell there. It had been there a while. Small new plants grew through the laces, which were still tied. I saw nothing else of interest, and so I walked back out the way that I had come in. We sold that property a while back, and I have moved to another larger town in a neighboring state. I am retired now and enjoying my days with my wife. Oh yes, about the dogs. I worked with our local rescue organization, and every dog, all 24, were eventually adopted out to families far away from Mississippi. Some actually live in Manhattan in New York City. One even lives with us now. She's an old dog now and short on time, but she's very comfortable. We gave her a good life after that ordeal. Believe me, she earned it. It was 6 years before I began to see evidence that the Bigfoot were back. Maybe it was the same clan, maybe it was a new clan. Maybe they never left and just kept a very low profile around my house. I will never know. I never stopped occasionally leaving them gifts through the years, but most of the time when I would come check back the next day, the gifts were still there unless it was food. But even then, any animal could have taken that food. During the last years that we lived there, I knew the young ones and the females were close. They were always present when I had the dogs out in the back playing with them. I think they like that kind of thing.